The 2026 International Colloquium Series Europe is sponsored by the Episcopal Diocese of California, the Tabernacle Community Development Corporation, the Waters Living Trust, and Grace Cathedral in San Francisco. With university sponsors, Pepperdine University, the University of Geneva, the Graduate Theological Union, the Catholic University of Leuven, and the Catholic University of Lyon. And community partners, the Cathedral Church of the Holy Trinity, the American Cathedral in Paris, the Chemin Neuf Community in France, Emmanuel Episcopal Church of Geneva, the Center for Liberation Theologies at the Catholic University of Leuven, and the French-speaking Institute of Systematic Theology and Ethics at the University of Geneva. With the 2026 hotel partner, Nest M Gallery, Paris La Défense, an Accor luxury hotel. And special thanks to the following: Dr. Christophe Chalamet, Dr. Estelle Sogbu, Dr. Judith Gruber, Dr. Dara Straub, Kim Powell, Dr. Anne-Marie Reinen, Dr. Raymond Carr, Dr. Valerie Miles-Tribble, and Colette Rogers Grizzell.
The Northern California Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Community Foundation is dedicated to promoting justice, health, education, and service. Please consider making a donation at NorcalMLKFoundation.org. Every donation makes a difference.
Taught music in southern India, in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. He taught for 13 years at the University of Rostock, and also as a scholar of liturgy at the University of Leipzig. He has a degree from with a thesis on religiously inspired jazz in the Christian tradition. He's currently a liturgist in Bavaria, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct.
Right? And has a bunch of projects. One of his recordings, which I bought before knowing Uwe several years ago, is titled The Pilgrimage. Came out at the end of 2024. Highly recommended. A trio CD with Arne Jansen, who is a guitar player, and Anders Jormin. I was mentioning him earlier. Anders Jormin, this incredible double bass player who has played with Don Cherry, Charles Lloyd, Bobo Stenson, Thomas Stanko. And they have several concerts coming up in June with this trio. And maybe one day we bring them, the three of them, to Geneva for another event of this kind. He's the editor of a book titled Die Spiritualität des Jazz, with contributions by a number of scholars, including Melvin Butler, a great saxophone player who plays with the fellowship band of Brian Blade's fellowship band, one of the great ensembles of jazz today. And he's co-founder of a resource online called bluechurch.ch, bluechurch.ch. So Uwe today is presenting on jazz as global devotional music. I will be up there changing the slides. The floor is yours, Uwe. And you'll get to hear Uwe at the Vespers at 7 p.m. at the Emmanuel Church.
So I actually chose to stand because the light is slightly better for my, unfortunately, slowly, do you say demise? What happens to eyes when they can't see so much? I need more light in my life, and I realize here is more light. So please, don't think I'll play piano, this will not happen. I had prepared the good German way, a real talk for half an hour, and I'll see how far I get, because I want to, of course, my experience with jazz is by people and by stories and narratives, and not necessarily by systematic systems. But now you will have to embrace the good old German culture of producing some sort of concepts to describe what happened in jazz history from a historical point of view, but also a bit from a musicological point of view, and I look very forward to discuss this later with you. So one thing, Christophe, if you could continue, if you like, these are the 3 steps I will do, good German tradition as well. So we will start with a lot of musical examples, and if you could show the next slide, you can just listen to them if you get the QR code, because there's no time to listen to the music, or it's very unfair to cut out something from a musical piece. So please, you will be guided to a website, and then you have 30 examples that are actually in certain categories, as open as possible, but that describe a bit what I get out of spiritual jazz. First slide.
I'm still taking photos. Everybody has the photo? No, I don't.
Yeah, we can put it up in the end.
Yeah.
So I'll walk you a bit through the interconnectedness of or meeting places of religion, spirituality, and jazz. And that's all super short. So the first one, to my knowledge, recorded example is Louis Armstrong in 1940. He recorded a couple of spirituals and original songs. The song that I point out is Cain and Abel. And he tells, in an actually quite complex composition, first he retells the story with his own words and then improvises on it. It's quite a modern piece for its time. Typical Armstrong, super modern, and it was released years later. Next slide. So you find kind of a modern language describing the biblical story, plus also a solo that mimics a bit the way how he sang. And this really stands out as some sort of like music theology dealing with the biblical text and also dealing with this unbelievable atrocity of, what happened in this story. So it's a fantastic example, and it shows the mastership of Armstrong to find an approach to it that still feels it's lighthearted. Despite the depths of it, it's just absolutely fantastic. 10 years later, we move into bebop, and as much as I was tempted to choose Thelonious Monk as well, I picked Charlie Parker as an example, as jazz, as you said already, Raymond, it moved away from danceable swing music into the concert halls. There was even a whole series by Norman Granz, Jazz in the Concert Hall, Jazz at the Philharmonic. And what I found interesting was that bebop connected already the avant-garde, the European avant-garde, with the American avant-garde. Next slide. So the piece Coco would be my sound example, composition by Charlie Parker, very fast. And it's inspired by the harmonic of Firebird Suite by Stravinsky. And there is this very interesting story where Charlie Parker heard right before he went on stage that Stravinsky was actually listening. He was visiting New York. And so he incorporated parts of the Firebird Suite into Coco. And we have heard already from Raymond, that's why I don't need to elaborate on it. Dr. Billy Taylor on the right coined at this time already the idea of American classical music for jazz. And that had a serious implication, even in bebop already, that he also hinted there must be a sacred side. And then again, next slide. 10 years later, we enter into a field of liturgical and sacred jazz. And the first recording, to my knowledge, is Liturgical Jazz by Edwin Summerlin, a student of George Russell, who lost his child right after birth. And his priest advised him to put it into music. And the church community embraced it to have a jazz service. And that was recorded, and the band itself traveled, and this piece has become quite famous. I can just encourage you to listen to it, because it is quite interesting that it takes the original traditional liturgy and he uses the language of that time, typical George Russell style, cool jazz with a lot of dissonances, and it blends very well together with the biblical readings, for example. And that was really, when people today ask, how do we do a jazz service? I would say, well, do it like him, because he was not afraid, after his priest gave him the possibility to say, okay, look, I'll play the most modern stuff right now that I know. And that was a very, I think, a courageous move. And that set a certain standard So liturgical jazz by Ed Summerlin. But clearly here the jazz is serving the liturgy. The whole dramaturgy of the music is composed following the liturgy. Next slide. I think there are actually two. There is the church in Downbeat. Here's a modern church in Copenhagen. This tradition of jazz churches goes back very early. The first one in the United States was St. Peter's Church in Manhattan, and then very quickly a couple of other churches worked with jazz, and Ed Summerlin worked also at St. Peter's for a long time. But this is a church I can recommend to you in Copenhagen. Farrah Sanders has played there, many people have played there from the spiritual jazz scene, and it has regular jazz services with fantastic setting and piano. And you can already see the concept is different. We have people sitting around. I just played there 4 weeks ago during communion. Everyone is in the room. You kind of have to find your way back to the band. And there's a continuum of music, plus hymns, traditional hymns. So Brason's church is one of the good or interesting places to visit. But first I have to go to the West Coast. Yeah, but you can also see, perhaps in the photo, it's a very colorful church, and the community is very colorful. And I think it's a good statement. That's why I really am behind it, for the way how jazz and church can meet. And the leader of the church is Janne Mark, a singer and composer, and she has released many jazz records on large labels, and also some of her hymns have been translated into different languages and can be found in hymn books. So there's actually feeding back, like Come Sunday von Ellington, feeding back into the church canon of sacred song. And I think that's a challenge for us. If we want to play in church, we kind of have to think, what are we dealing with here? You know, at least in Europe, it's a big challenge, and it's nice to see, oh, there's actually a process that gets these two sides connected. Next slide. That's all very common to you guys, but I still have to go there. After liturgical jazz, very quickly, a couple of commissions happened. The most famous, perhaps, are the one for Mary Williams and Duke Ellington. And his first concert, I've heard some musicians saying, well, he got a lot of money for it. I think it was not easy to understand what was happening at that time. There were commissions out, suddenly churches paid for jazz. And I think it was a big competition at some point. But his sacred concert, the first one, is so worthwhile listening to. The piece I picked is in the beginning, because it has such a modern text, the absence of everything in our lives. And that's basically the start of the concert. It's very powerful. And again, he had a tap dancer, so as soon as there was an invitation, the people took it, like jazz musicians did, took it on the edge. They didn't hold back. So, very courageous concert. Next. That's from the premiere, San Francisco Grace Cathedral. And then there's Mary Williams. I think this is already AI, I'm not sure, but I found this photo because there's St. Patrick's Cathedral. And that was later on in her life, her third Mass was performed in front of 3,000 people. So that was a crowning achievement for her, but she wanted, of course, take it to Italy, and I think it did not work out. Yeah. So these two characters can stand for a whole tradition of sacred music in the tradition of jazz. The management of Duke Ellington I have the original paper, they had the instructions to say, please say this is not a jazz concert. This comes back to what Raymond said, all the people I'm talking about, Armstrong as well, they will not say they play jazz. I think Armstrong said, I play syncopated music or something. It was always, I play my music. And Ellington said, okay, it's a sacred concert. I don't want to call it jazz. And I think that's the strength of jazz, to have that opportunity. As much as Bach was upset, we are playing music. In his cantatas, every Sunday in Bach cantatas, he had new inspiration from Italy, from France. He borrowed a lot from other musical cultures that excited him. So it was a Bach cantata, and the rest is history. So it was that understanding, I think. Okay, we can move on. So I've distinguished here a little, looking at modern spirituality, a little change between liturgical jazz, which serves the liturgy with songs that the congregation can join, And here in a sacred concert, there's a chance for addressing your own music theology. You could also say it's kind of face in my fashion. You know, you pick the aspects you like or Ellington liked and then Melody Williams liked, and then you get this statement. It's strong, it's music theology, great for research if you like that, and great for engaging artists. And that's really a field today that is still thriving. There are a lot of artists writing contemporary jazz, masses, and so on. And it's certainly a clear direction between the artist, theology, and the church. And the next step came with spiritual jazz. So now we're moving on to what John Coltrane voiced several times in interviews. I think this is particularly encouraging in the same spirit and vibe what you already shared. It's powerful to say, I want to inspire my audience, lift them up to create meaningful lives. And it was very touching to actually hear that about the blues and the reality today. I was reminded recently when Marsalis has this democracy movement, and I laughed when someone said, aren't you a little bit depressed about current state of affairs? And he said, look, if I'm a doctor, I walk into a room and it's full of sick people, am I leaving? So I thought, this is the right attitude. He has the skills and the power to do something with his music. So this is in the same vein. And again, Coltrane doesn't hold back. I mean, a lot of people thought with the Love Supreme, oh my goodness, that's not jazz anymore. It always happens in jazz history. And so he actually also, even though he was established, a lot of people really said, look, I mean, this is really challenging. And it continued like that for him. So we can continue. I think many of you know this effect that happens in the fourth movement of Love Supreme. A psalm is recited that he wrote in the studio. And you can actually, I've had the experience several times that people sang it in the same way. And I think if you go to St. John Coltrane Church, you'll have the same, you sing the psalm. Yeah. And it's very, very moving. And it follows actually the psalm tones, the way how he grew up, how he listened to liturgy. Yeah. So that's a very, very important, now, if I speak as a musicologist, here it gets super exciting, because here I can clearly say without a clear religious imagination or liturgical idea, this piece would not exist. Coltrane had a very clear vision. He didn't tell it to his other musicians. They all just knew what they had to play. I will show you the score later. It's a very simple score. The melody was not notated. And there's this double meaning is there for me already. He didn't see any need to tell them. I mean, it was his prayer, he addressed it, and the beauty is there anyways. And it was discovered much later that this structure was so formal and thought of. So, great example for me what spiritual jazz encapsulates. I'll try to define it later, so bear with me. So, we can move on. Yeah, that's possibly the photo really where he's writing that poem out to put it on his music stand. There's a lot of documentation now in books about the Love Supreme. Yeah. And that's another element of John Coltrane that he developed earlier. He practiced modulations in the circle of fifths. One of his favorite pieces, or famous pieces, Giant Steps, works like that. But he was inspired, as Yusuf Latif told me and many other people, that he worked on the Kabbalah and the mystical sacred geometry. And so Yusuf said that Coltrane gave him this and practiced with it all the time. He said, I don't practice scales, I just practice this. And recently a scholar had found that in interstellar space, which is supposedly free, talking about creating order, Coltrane follows the same cycle. It's a long, free improvisation, but then you can see, oh, he's actually following sacred geometry in a free way. So that's a beautiful example of freedom and creating order, but such on a sublime level that, it has its own beauty. Okay, we can move on. And this technique of vocalization is something that Brian Blake uses a lot. Melvin told me that Brian calls these songs God songs. So he writes songs or prayers and then he takes the text away. So the band gets only the instrumental notes and he will not reveal it in the same way. Some of the songs, of course, he writes also beautiful songs. Mama Rosa is a record from Brian Blade I can highly recommend. And one of the songs is actually used a lot, the Serenity Prayer in jazz services now, which I'm very glad about. I try to add pieces into the canon of church music where possible, and I was glad that he was able to surpass the copyright. He said if it's used for congregations, it's always fine. It's a beautiful piece, Serenity Prayer. But in general, this band has a lot, I think there's a lot to learn from the way how they interact on stage. And Melvin has produced an article for us where he talks about the healing experience for people, that they had a couple of people who wrote later who had tremendous life changes following the fellowship band. I personally can totally understand that. The music has that. And one very interesting aspect comes up with this band is that they are very much in the Coltrane, post-Coltrane vein of building up a huge climax musically. And Melvin said that's for him the same as being in his church, playing organ. He feels something, the spirit is moving. This is how it's supposed to happen. It's not what we would think from a musical standpoint, oh, you put all the energy in there and then there's a gap. It's actually dancing with the spirit, engaging with it. And that leads to that energy. And he has a funny quote from the alto player who plays and plays and it gets more and more intense and then he stops. And Brian Blade slams the drums and so on. And they asked him, why did you stop playing? He said, that's why I wanted to go. That's a total openness. And creating that space out of ecstasy is something that, or intensity is something that I find spiritually very interesting because it's often it's voiced that the music provides a vessel. And I think that's theologically quite interesting. You're not providing the content, but the vessel for the spirit or for something to happen. So, Immanuel Wilkins is also in that tradition, one of my absolute favorite players, but also in absolute beautiful sound. And conceptually, he really sets a new standard, I find, for this engagement with spirituality. I wish we could have him talk about his latest records. Yeah, so I'm trying to show always a couple of contemporary artists. There's one piece in my playlist that you can see. It's an ongoing stream. I will move on quickly. Because after this kind of explorational time, engagement with Christianity, there were, of course, movements to different religions parallel happening. Big one is to Islam. Many musicians became Muslim. I've written a list of names that I can't find now. But I think maybe I can move on and find the list because it is quite interesting. You know, Blakey, of course, Ahmad Jamal, Yusuf Lateef embraced Islam very early on, especially the Ahmadiyya movement, and seeing it for themselves as a source of liberation and self-determination. And later on, they traveled to North Africa, which actually created new jazz schools, even in the case of Art Blakey. Another important influence was Baha'i. Dizzy Gillespie and the United Nations Orchestra expressed that a lot. Then Buddhism in modern traditions, Herbie Hancock, Wayne Shorter, followed very devoutly Buddhist practice. And this could all go under one umbrella of feeling what we Christians call the Corpus Dei, or the global body of Christ, that at least from Wayne Shorter, I know that personally, that he says that was for him a glimpse of hope of a united world. Because when you see I think it's the Zengar Kai movement, people from many cultures meet, pray together. That's very powerful. And he turned to this movement in the 70s already, so very early on. And so he says, when we play music, we play with the same vision as a band, stretching beyond what we know to the unknown. And that's actually an expression of our faith. A very special case and wonderful case is Alice Coltrane, who founded in Ashram, California. I've picked one of the pieces that she sings that just came out many, many years later. It's an absolutely wonderful piece where she blends her growing up as being a gospel organ player, with her singing bhajans, religious devotional music, from India, and she's able to bring these two worlds together for herself. What made in this ashram the people meditate. So it's very, very powerful music. So we have Hinduism on many, many levels involved in the whole followers around Alice Coltrane until today. A very, maybe not so well known one is Alicia Beshel's-Karyat. She lives in London, but is from the Ukraine. She plays harp, has a very powerful band, and embraces very much this kind of soundscapes that Alice Coltrane had in the 70s and 80s. You'll find a piece of her in my playlist. So that's really a unique tradition, and a lot of my turn towards Christianity came from India first, and that's why I like the term devotional, because devotion is the attitude, what Johann Sebastian Bach said. It's you turn towards God, and then you make music. And my teacher in Indian music, she said, you need to study your music, your devotional music. If you're here, study Bach now, because she knew Bach, and I didn't. And I was really humbled to see, oh wow, this is very, very much connected for many people who think about devotion as an attitude, spiritual, virtual attitude. So then I have a little map of many, many places where jazz traveled in the 70s until today. I think you all know other examples. I don't need to name all of them. But the quote before from Herbie Hancock is important for me. He says, the things that keep jazz alive is that it's so free and so open that to not only lend its influence to other genres, but to borrow and be influenced by other genres. That's the way it breathes. So it's a very organic interaction. And that might not mean much to you if you like composed music, but as a jazz musician, it's the essential quality that distinguishes it from pop music as well. And I think that's why, at least for Herbie Hancock, the access to a global citizenship as a jazz musician, as he tries to promote through the UNESCO, is super relevant. And I've recently been working with a radio station in London. It's called One Jazz, that addresses the same musicians that work in this field. So that gives me personally a little bit hope, because when I studied, there was the time of the young lions from record labels, and now I can see the record labels turn towards spiritual jazz, even Blue Note, for example. And that's really a big encouragement that there's a new wave coming, fed by this kind of universal dimension of jazz. So now we can move on beyond my fantastic word map. So looking at the current state of spirituality, as far as I can see, we have a reawakening of, at least in the jazz world, of spiritual concerns, even the acceptance of religion, even of Christianity, which is a big step forward for some artists to openly speak about their faith. I have one example that I would share. And in general, it shows that we are, in comparison maybe to the way how theologians work in jazz, you have all the issues that came up through theology in many, many countries and cultures, all mixed together. You have people who are like Abdullah Ibrahim Brand, who is a devout Muslim, and then he's also Christian. And then he has more to say to many cultures. And that alone is a quality that is what I would call a polyphony of the sacred that exists in jazz. And as soon as you start talking to a musician, even to Christian musicians doing jazz services, they would be able to speak about faith of very, very different traditions. And it comes from the knowledge of having friends who also play music, who are also spiritual, and who follow different traditions. And that's I think, a fantastic quality of jazz. So our payroll could be higher, but we can inform about the way how, esoteric or spiritual movements are vibrant. So at least in Germany, for example, young jazz musicians were asked last year about their most pressing issues, and the first issue was spirituality. And I was really surprised, because we come from a very conceptual country that loves, clear concept. I protest, or I do super complex music, and spirituality. Yeah. So, okay. So now I want to talk about one effect that I find is very important because now we come to this very difficult area that I try to embrace in a positive way. We do have different streams, and I always have the feeling to address this movement through different streams in jazz and cultures by looking at the bridge as an example. So if I'm tempted to learn more about Indian music, I have to go there. And if I stop on the bridge, instead of trying to become a musician in the Indian tradition, which for me would have been impossible because the mastership is so high. When I was there, I was 16, it didn't make any sense because there were already people playing music on such a high level. So it's better to stop. That was my insight, to stop on the bridge. You look around, you see where you're coming from, and also you see with a new perspective what happens. Because you're communicating, you create something different without claiming that this is Indian music or a white guy playing black music or whatever. It's very important to embrace what happens here on the bridge for me, because this is actually the reality. As a jazz musician, it's very hard to, because we struggle with authenticity. I told Christophe, I don't want to play a Coltrane piece I haven't performed live, because I don't want to do that. I don't want to create an image of myself that I'm not. And I think the idea of cultural appropriation tends for me to go in jazz into a direction that is limiting our experiences artificially, because jazz has been traveling around. Now it's a way how to look at it. And my look that I want to share is the bridge. And it's a transcultural look to say, if we meet, something new exists and comes together in music through the dialogue that you've been mentioning, and you work with who is on the bridge. Yeah, we can continue. So conceptually now, on the bridge, we could also say we have a person like Mary Lou Williams, becoming a very devout Catholic, writing a mass. So she has, of course, it's an absolutely incredible jazz pianist already. She brings qualities of jazz with her. Let's take the improvisational aspect. In a religious dimension, she is certainly into a transformational process involved all the time, which in her case, I think really had an impact on her face or on her way how she decided to come out again and perform music. And of course, the Holy Spirit comes into play, as I mentioned with Brian Blade, as a reality. So let's say the religious dimension comes into play, and also the musical dimension becomes a new religious connotation. People who are playing spiritual jazz talk more about trust, courage, hope, healing, instead of saying, oh, there was a cool impro dude. Huh? So there's much more human quality there. And I think this dialogue is something in particular that should be explored if you want to talk more about jazz and theology with rigid or different systems that you can fight about. But I think it's very important, because that's really something that musicians usually are not so much aware of, because we tend to stick in one corner. So the next slide. This is a general idea I've been working on since years, is to look at the ritual potential of jazz. There are many studies now, and I'm also interested in how it becomes more and more clear that the way how our brain reacts to what happens in improvisation is very different than to what happens when we hear composed music, because the way how the musicians interact does something to our brain that is nearly on the same activity level, and that's really crazy. But it's a fact. Charles Lim, also in California, I think, actually has done studies like that. And so with that also, you could see that there is this leere Offenheit, there is the need for a clear space before you enter it, which is a deeply religious practice. And so Andrew Newberg, for example, has written about prayer and improvisation, connecting these worlds, because I do think there is a lot to be learned from prayer, silence, improvisation. It's a big scene here in monasteries now, that you can invite musicians to improvise, but also have silence together and see what happens then. That's one aspect. I wanted to share the ritual aspect, and also, of course, liturgical aspects. You can always look at music engaging with time and words in different ways. You can go one further. I don't want to bore you with these things, but you can definitely find clear different expressions in spiritual jazz. Some are very much lament, some are very much a Gloria. David Murray always comes to mind. When he does gospel music, it's like, wow, it's like bring on, set the house on fire. There are artists who really live in one tradition very, very deeply. And since we have such a huge scene of spiritual jazz now, you can create listening services, which I've done, where people just sit through a liturgy of spiritual jazz, from a Kyrie to Gloria, to a Sanctus mystical, and yeah. So that's just an idea. I don't want to. Yeah, you can continue. And this takes us back, and this is how I close, to the general idea of this engagement that leads to all these expressions that can be applied liturgically and also considered to be theological statements. This is the score of A Love Supreme, also well known, I think, for some. It's in the Smithsonian connection. You can look it up online. So it's a very simple structure that Coltrane had and gave to his band. Cadences, but it's the words I find very interesting. He says in the end, zum Beispiel Alabama. So we had recorded Alabama before, and his pianist, Nicotana, knew what he meant, the solemnness of that chord, the depth. And that the word stands for a whole world, a whole story of unbelievable human atrocity. So he works with his own codification in the sense of human experience. One more slide. This one is the prayer, of course, but then what I love in the sketch paper is these ideas about he makes a plan for the whole suite, but then he also writes, I need to pick up saxophone reeds on the way to the studio. Yes, the whole world comes into this making music process. And of course, when we listen to the music, we would never get that idea that it's so free, but it is so defined. Yes, you can go. I say that because many artists have, at their 50th anniversary, put out new versions of A Love Supreme. And Branford Marsalis apparently had a very difficult time doing the recording. He just felt he couldn't live up to it. And then Ravi Coltrane said, we have to go to church. And so they went to different churches. and then it was possible for him. And he said it was a deeply humbling thing just to realize, wow, now something new is floating. But my point here that I would like to develop further is the idea that pieces like this create something like a musical faith narrative. It's a statement about personal faith that inspires continues to inspire other people, but it's a closed narrative. And there's a huge discussion on the decline of rituals in our society. And one aspect is that we lose the narratives. We have open-ended narratives. We have a series that has 20 seasons and continues. And in our time, particularly with AI, I think the future of jazz will be decided how much human quality, how much closed narratives we are able to show to people. And lastly, so if that's interesting for you, these are musicological terms you can copy. Of course, the style of Coltrane, and then next slide. But what you can't really copy is the way how the music engages with the spirituality. So that's my current state, where I ordered the listening examples for you in these three categories as an idea to say, look, we have people like Anaya Doraiswamy, she's an Indian musician who uses a lot of what she calls religious grammar from her upbringing in South India and puts it into jazz. That's a clear integration of specific religious musical traditions, but she doesn't claim it's spiritual music even. It's the grammar is being used. And then you have people who use these big metaphors like Todd Gustafson, Immanuel Wilkins, incredible images, and they create music around it. And the first category is the one that Coltrane started, following a sacred text. And these are the three main streams in contemporary spiritual jazz. We can continue. And I hope, of course, it's appropriate with Martin Luther King Jr. always to speak about dreams. I do hope that there is more research done, and there is more like a connection between archives of the history and also of the ongoing process and education, because this field that we are all talking about is not taught, to my knowledge. Otherwise, I would be there. Thank you very much. I hope it works. It should work.
Thank you very much.
The young lady that you attended, and she's saying that she went into the amazing grace, or she went into, she just went.
We're going to have to move to the Emmanuel Church soon to practice a little bit, even though jazz, we might want to have a little practice time. But we have a moment if you have questions, remarks, Uwe. You see the wealth of his reflection on these issues, on these themes, so wonderful. Anybody who would like to engage, Uwe? We can continue tomorrow morning for those who are ready to come back to talk at greater length on some of these themes, but if anybody would like to raise a question, it's possible.
I won't be there tomorrow morning. I go back to the concert tomorrow night. So I'm very sorry, but
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so I have one over here. Thanks first of all. This is my question. So I came in apologies. I know we talked about spirituality in jazz. We talked about the jazz in devotional and ecclesial settings. You're probably more familiar than I with the work of Kirk Whalen, for example, and the notion of the gospel according to jazz. And someone else comes to mind is Charles Gale, who has been a very open proponent of proselytizing and in some ways viewing jazz as a means to that. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are with regards to that, to evangelism in jazz, perhaps distinct from spirituality in jazz and ecclesial worship.
One very interesting concept is the Church of Sound and Light. They have sound streams. They invite a band, and the people sometimes people share testimonies of faith, but it's all happening within the jazz context. The audience sits around the band, and there's nothing, no preaching, no liturgy, but jazz is there, and it's often, of course, spiritual jazz. But that is, for example, I find a genuine outreach. The community grows and grows because people come back, and then there's a pastor, or then there's someone else talking. But that really has grows. And it basically started because they said we have some jazz musicians in the community, like the folky saxophonist, and they said, look, do you want to play a concert? And then we do a dedication to Alice Coltrane, then it all started. So that's a thing I really would like to see more happening in churches, just trusting the music and the musicians, you know. Yeah. Well, thank you all. You had such a long day and travels, and I feel so blessed by what you said before. Because more we need in our time is encouragement and the acknowledgement to stand in the. What do we do? We stand at the wall. The rest is easy, but that's really what I find warms my heart, and I can tell my children. So
Thank you. I know we hope to welcome you back in Geneva, and also the American delegation. I'll keep to that word. For more conversations and more music together these coming months and years, hopefully. Yes. So thank you very much, Uwe.
you're welcome.
The International Colloquium Series, confronting global issues with moral clarity and intellectual depth.